My guest today is multi-New York Times bestselling author Kathy Reichs, and her first novel, Déjà Dead, published in 1997, won the Ellis Award for Best First Novel and was an international bestseller. Now, her newest offering, Fire and Bones, is Kathy's 23rd novel featuring forensic anthropologist Temperance Brennan, and she was also the producer of Fox Television's longest running scripted drama, Bones, based on her work and her novels. Now, she is one of very few forensic anthropologists certified by the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome New York Times bestselling author and forensic anthropologist Kathy Reichs to the show. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'm very excited because I have also been a fan of Bones, but your novel is absolutely fantastic. I enjoyed the whole story, but I have to ask, and for all of my viewers and listeners out there, you are one of very few forensic anthropologists certified by, again, the American Board of Forensic Anthropology. For everyone out there, what is a forensic anthropologist?
Oh, we are biological anthropologists with a specialty in the human skeleton. We work primarily for medical examiners and coroners, but also for the military and other lawyers, police, whoever. And we address mainly two questions: helping to identify who is it, unidentifiable human remains. They might be mummified or burned or mutilated or dismembered or decomposed or maybe just bones. And the other question we address is what happened to that person? What was the cause or manner of death? Those are maybe how long have they been dead? Maybe what was the body treatment after death? But that's the main area that we address. And it's when the coroner can't, or the medical examiner can't do a normal autopsy because the body is just too compromised.
Well, I mean, how long does it take to study to become an anthropologist, especially with one working with law enforcement?
Yeah, there are lots of different kinds of anthropologists. So, a forensic anthropologist, you have to get your PhD. That usually takes 5 years after undergraduate. I think that's the average. Some people are quicker, some people are slower. And then you're supposed to, I believe, practice for 3 years under guidance. And then you can sit for your board exams for you to become board certified.
And really, this is the type of profession where you really become an in depth investigator, right?
Yeah, you become a member of a team. I like to think of it. I don't solve any cases all by myself, but I'm brought in, where the question would require an expert in bones. And I would work with the pathologist. I might work with a forensic dentist. I might work with, I don't know, a fire and arson specialist. I might work with someone who's a specialist in DNA. So there's always a mix of different specialists that come together as a team.
Between watching crime dramas on television or reading in the news about a particular criminal case, I've always seen the first thing that they may mention is they are checking dental records. But if there are no dental records, how do you find out who it is?
Well, and even if there are dental records, if you don't have a presumptive ID, we think this is John Doe, then you can go to John Doe's dentist. But if you have a complete unknown, you don't know whose dentist to go to for dental records. So, there are different kinds of cases that I would be asked to look at. Some are the completely unknown. We have no idea. Then I do what's called a biological profile: the age, the sex, the ancestral background, the height, any medical history, any little peculiarities, anything I can put together. And then the police can compare that profile to a missing person description. And
Well,
then
have
you have,
you? No,
we
go
think
ahead.
it, we think it could be Jane Doe. And then that's when they can get dental records or DNA.
Well, have you ever had a case that was very, very difficult, but then over time you had the eureka moment and figured out who it was?
Yes, I had a little child who was in my lab for years and years and years. And I take those little bones out every now and then and look at them, but there was nothing more that could be done. And then for some reason we had a breakthrough. It was like I'd had the bones had been discarded 10 years before they were discovered, it turned out. And then I'd had them in my lab for 10 years. And then finally we got this little guy identified.
Wow,
Yeah.
that is extremely interesting. And I love this type of study. But let's talk about this incredible new novel that you wrote, Fire and Bones. Now, for me, in all honesty, it kept me glued to the pages. And I loved the twist in terms of the story and the characters, because for me, I didn't know where it was going, where it was leading, and there were so many surprises that I want to see this on the big screen because this book is so good. But for the audience, what is Fire and Bones about?
Oh, it starts out, not surprisingly, with a fire in an area in Washington, D.C. And I've never set a book there. I've never sent Tempe to Washington, in a neighborhood called Foggy Bottom. And I was just intrigued with the Foggy Bottom. I like to say Foggy Bottom. I wanted to call the book Foggy Bottom Bones, and my publisher said, no, we're not doing that. Anyway, there's a fire in this very old house, and they knew there were 4 people in there who died in the fire. So Tempe is asked to come to the scene. But it turns out this house has a sub cellar that's not on any of the plans. And she is asked to go down there, and they find another little tiny woman, a little body down there. And of course she becomes intrigued with, well, who is this little lady, and what's she doing in this sub basement? And how long has she been down there, and how did she die? Was she murdered? So that's kind of a secondary story. And the book also gets into some of the history of Foggy Bottom. We all have heard about Al Capone and Chicago and the bootleggers during Prohibition. Well, Washington, D.C. had what was known as the Foggy Bottom Gang, a group of 3 brothers, the Waring brothers, and they controlled all the bootleg liquor during Prohibition. So I bring in some of the history of that as well.
You know, how do you come up with the idea of a story? Because like you just said, you've never taken Temperance into Washington, D.C. before. So that was really new. And at the same time, did you do research on, I guess, certain types of homes in the area? Because I had never heard of a sub basement before.
Yeah, I'm pretty familiar with DC. I went to school there, undergraduate. I went to American University, and my daughter and 2 of my grandkids live there. They don't live in Foggy Bottom, but they don't live far away. So I thought our nation's capital would be an interesting setting for my readers, and to learn some of the history of the district that probably most people weren't very familiar with.
That is so interesting. Now, one of the things about this book, my father was a funeral director, and he would tell me that the worst smell in the world is the burning of human flesh. He goes, it's a smell that no one ever forgets. Why did you base this story on or implementing burn victims as part of the storyline?
Because I hadn't done that before. Each of my books, forensic anthropology. So you've got to have human remains that are in compromised condition. So I hadn't yet looked at fire victims. So, and I don't want to just do bones after bones after bones in every book. In each book I do, I write good old fashioned murder mysteries, but the solution is driven, at least in part, by science, by forensic science. So in each book I bring in a different aspect of forensic science. And I thought, fire and arson, well, that's interesting. I haven't done that before. Let's go for it.
Were you surprised that after, well, let's say the first 22 novels that you had never done burn victims before?
I may have touched on it peripherally, but it was never a central theme as it is in this one.
Now,
I'd have to go back. I can't always remember what all those books are about. So
yeah, one of the things that I absolutely loved about this book was not only just reading the story and traveling along with all of the characters. I love the way you implemented some things into the book to where the reader learns and actually gets a little bit educated about certain things. And there was a section in the book where you made this statement, and it's every fire triggers an investigation. Where was the origin? What was the spread pattern? What was the cause of ignition? Was the blaze accidental or intentionally set? I mean, there is a lot that goes on in finding the cause of a fire, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I don't presume to know that myself, but I'm fortunate because I am a forensic scientist that I work with people who are experts in those fields. So I was able, as with every book, I was able to pose a lot of questions about fire examination, fire analysis.
The thing that I really appreciated was the explanation in the book about how fire, and I didn't even know this, but how fire affects the human body. I mean, the way that you weave science into your plots makes the story not just fiction, but a learning experience for the reader. Why was it so important, let's say this element, for the reader to understand how fire affects the human body?
I just thought, my books are forensic science driven, and as I said, we hadn't touched on this area before, and I find it interesting. And I always figure, well, if I find it interesting, hopefully my readers are going to find it interesting also.
Yeah, I mean, I would read that section over again because I was so, um, I don't know, because I was so involved in reading the book that, I mean, I was really surprised because reading this particular novel, sometimes you get lost in the fact and thinking that you're actually reading a true story, which is just brilliant writing. So to have a book of fiction but have the reader travel along with all the characters, but still feel that there is something very true to this whole thing just makes a brilliant novel.
Well, thank you for that. And I hope I got it right. I did put in a lot of the history of Foggy Bottom and the Foggy Bottom gang. And it interested me. So I thought, well, I think my readers will like this.
I also like the way that you wrote about the characters, especially those that were on the side of law enforcement. And as I was looking at some of these characters, I kept thinking, this probably come from you. You've gained a lot of experience dealing with so many people over the years that I guess with some law enforcement, maybe they don't go the extra mile to solve a case. They basically just want to get the work done and move on to something else. And I was getting that from one of the characters.
Yeah, and you've got to. I've never worked with any detectives that weren't fully engaged and fully committed and fully cooperating and fully appreciative of my experience. But of my expertise, but you do have to throw in some friction there. If everybody gets along, you're not going to have those little subplots of what do we do about convincing this cop or this fireman or whatever it is that our heroine really has something to contribute. And that's often and I've never experienced that, but that's often the basis of the friction between the characters.
Yeah, that's what I liked about the different characters, especially on the law enforcement side, because part from the human element, there are people that have professions. Maybe it's law enforcement, maybe it's medical, and they become numb to their profession. And maybe that's because so much negative, or maybe there's so much death associated with part of their job that it's a protective area in which they kind of put it behind them and not try to get so emotionally involved. But when it comes to solving certain cases, I mean, there are, I guess, Temperance Brennan is probably the perfect example of wanting to find the answer and never giving up. And I believe that we have a lot of detectives out there that actually do that.
Absolutely. And she is definitely tenacious. Once she grabs onto something, she doesn't let go. And she's stubborn. She doesn't take no for an answer very well. But she's smart and she's very strong. And I think the other thing that's endearing, and one of the things I wanted to do in creating my protagonist, was that she has a good sense of humor. And she particularly has a good sense of humor about herself. And she often, either in her own mind or sometimes she actually verbally says, makes fun of herself. And I think hopefully the readers find her approachable. She's not perfect. She does have flaws.
Yeah. I also like the way that you brought in the media. And because
Yeah.
reporters, they get in the way.
Well, generally, Temperance Brennan does not want to talk to reporters. She is not very welcoming to the media when she's working on a case. And I'm that way too. Now, when I'm selling a book, I'm more than happy to talk to the media. But yeah, she just has found that if you make a statement while you're working on a case, it often just comes back to haunt you because they get it wrong, or it gets taken out of context, or it shows up later in court when you're on the stand, or so it's better to not, in her opinion, and I agree with her, during the working of an investigation, better not to do anything but maybe share the basic facts.
Yeah, because, as I was reading along, my thought was like, yeah, you really have to be careful because if you say something in the middle of a case, it's either going to become a headline that can compromise the case or it becomes clickbait for a news media's website.
Yeah, yeah. Just it's better not to. So,
Yeah.
but
Well,
she does become good friends with the other one of the main characters in this story is a woman named Ivy Doyle, and she is a journalist. And surprisingly, the two women, they're very similar to each other, and they are both committed to finding out who this mysterious woman is from the basement of this burned down house and finding out what the cause of this fire was. Was it intentional? And if so, who did it and why? So she and Ivy Doyle end up working well together, and that's unusual for a Tempe to deal with the media in that way.
now, you alluded to earlier that you actually had a true to life case where it was a child and basically took 20 years to find out who it was. In this book, has there ever been a real life case where it took 80 years to find the answer?
Uh, Phew, I'd have to think back. 80 years is a long time for documentation to I guess 80 years ago, what were we talking about? Like 19 do the math. I
Oh
don't
my gosh, are we talking 1940?
Yeah, so the 1940s. If documentation had been made, if it had survived, that could be a tough call. But I've had cases that were, I'm trying to think, the oldest case I ever had solved was, it may have been this little child that went missing in 63 and was buried. And then his little bones were, because cemetery plots are often reused. So these kids noticed these little bones being thrown out of a grave being dug, and they collected them, and then they got scared and tossed them over the side of a road, and then they were collected and they ended up in my lab some 50 years after this little boy had died. So that was a tough one, but we eventually did get it solved and figure out that these bones had come from a grave. The little boy had actually died. He was 5 or 6, had died of a car accident. But yeah, so
Wow. Well, I want the audience to read your book because I'm a big fan, like I said, of the Bones TV series. And one of the things I love is I love the buddy dynamic. I mean, Bones, Castle, Starsky and Hutch, Chips.
hmm.
I mean, all great examples. But in your novel, I noticed something. You kept the relationship between Tempe and Ryan more distant this time, but with tension. Why did you do that?
I don't want it to be the same in every book. And if they're just all, I suppose you could write a series in which you have a couple and they're happy and they work together, blah, blah, blah. I just thought it would be more interesting if the dynamics of their relationship, and they're in a pretty good place now because this has been going on since 1997. I think when the first book came out, she worked with Ryan way back then, and then they finally got together. And so your characters and the relationships between your characters have to constantly be evolving and changing. And so I just wanted to put them And they do lead this two geographic area lifestyle where they commute. She's from the Carolinas and he's from Montreal. So going back and forth, they managed to make it work. But, it's a lot of frequent flyer miles involved in the relationship.
Well, since your first novel, 1997, what year uh, did Bones debut? And then how did that whole situation happen?
Yeah, I think we went on air in 2005, it seems like, and off air in 2017. We're on for 12 seasons. How did that come about? I had been approached by a number of uh, producers, but it never felt right. But when I was approached by Barry Josephson and Hart Hansen, who came to be our executive producers, and Hart was our showrunner, we were just all on the same page about it. We wanted a character based show. We didn't want to do another police procedural. We wanted to create characters that the audience would care about and become engaged with and involved in their lives. And we wanted to put humor in the show, which I do with my books. And that's hard because you're dealing with violent death every book, every episode of the TV show. Our shows would always start out with a body being discovered in less than, pristine condition. How do you put humor into that when you're dealing with violent death in each episode? So I think our writers did a brilliant job of that. But anyway, Hart and Barry and I were all on the same page about all that. And so I optioned the character to them.
Yeah, and again, one of the longest running dramatic series on television. You got to be proud of that.
On Fox. I don't know if it's the
Yeah, on
longest one.
Fox. Yeah.
But of course, we're very proud of that.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised that it actually ended.
Yeah, I know. What can I say? Well, David and Emily are now both finished. David Boreanaz finished SEAL Team, so he's free, and people are talking about a reboot. I don't know. Probably not. But
Wow. Well, on this brand new book, Fire and Bones, I am not going to give the ending away,
no.
but I loved how there was like this double twist with the ending. I never saw it coming, but you
Okay.
keep the reader completely glued to every page. And one of the things that I loved how you wrote this novel is that the reader has to be a bit of a detective themselves to find out who done it, which I just find completely brilliant because it allows the reader to be completely absorbed and involved in this story.
And I think that's the appeal of thrillers and mysteries, is that part of the fun is that you try to figure it out before the author gives you the answer. And if I figure it out in reading someone else's book before the end, I'm a little disappointed in the author. They're supposed to surprise me. You're
Yeah,
supposed to not see the twist coming.
yeah, and I went back because I do so many I do so many film reviews, and when I get to read a novel, and this one really took me by surprise because with film you can always, if you look closely, there's always clues
Yeah.
that can lead up to the twist or who actually did it. And that's one thing I love about these shows is because we're always trying to guess. But in this book, nobody sees it coming.
But
Nobody is.
there are little clues in there. If you go back after you see it, you go back and you go, oh, right. Yes.
Yeah, and that's what happened to me when
Yeah.
it was revealed. I went, wait a minute, and then I
Yeah.
went, oh, and that's what I love about this because I love the fact that I didn't figure it out at all, but you kind of put a double twist towards the ending of the story, which was just beautifully done. I mean,
Thank you.
I'm this book made me a bigger fan than ever. So I
Oh,
can't
well,
wait for novel 24.
I'm working. As soon as we finish this interview, I'm sitting in front of my keyboard and I'll go right back to work.
Well, so and this book is already out now, correct?
Yes, it came out not last August.
How long does it take you to write a novel, by the way?
By contract, I do a book a year. So I don't usually get started right away. There's the time spent thinking and cogitating and Then I do a little bit of outlining, not much. And then from the time I start, and I just do it in a very linear way. I do chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, chapter. My daughter, if she's in a good mood, she writes the love scene, and if she's feeling blue, she writes the death scene. And I can't do that. I do it in a very progressive, linear fashion. So I I'd say the actual period of writing is, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 months, but there's a lot leading up to that. And then once I get a first draft, of course, then you rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it again.
Yeah, I just find writers to be so fascinating, not just novelists, but even those that are writing screenplays and creating things like this. This Fire and Bones is one of those that I would love to see as a full feature film. Either a full feature film or a television movie, because there's
Yeah.
just so much in this book that can be explored, dive into the characters even deeper. But you see, that's what you did here, because I love character development, and you really brought that out in this new novel.
Thank you. Good. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So, of course, you have stellar experience in this area. So I wouldn't
Yeah.
expect anything less from you
Oh,
with this good of a
pressure.
novel. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I can tell you this. Kathy Reichs' newest novel, Fire and Bones, is a must read for all fiction lovers. And well, if you're a literary detective, this book is for you, because you will not be disappointed. As for me, after reading Fire and Bones, I literally want more and more. And again, in Fire and Bones, forensic anthropologist Temperance Brennan is called to Washington, D.C. to investigate the remnants of a devastating fire, a job she expects that will take her no more than a few days. Instead, the discovery of an unexpected body, one not killed by the blaze, in the hidden sub-basement of the home, sends Tempe down a rabbit hole that gets deeper and twistier than she could have ever expected. Now, Fire and Bones is available where all great books are sold, so get your copy today. And I also encourage you to head over to kathyreichs.com for all of her books and more. And Kathy, all I can say is keep writing more Bones books, because I want to read more.
I'm doing it.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, head over to kathyreichs.com and check out the brand new novel, her 23rd, Fire and Bones. You'll fall in love with it just like I did. I want to thank you for watching as well as listening. So as for me, you'll either see me at the movies or from the red carpet.